I enjoy playing video games, but the controllers are just so confusing. I wish there was a way I could play video games without the controller. Yeah, never mind. Video game controllers are one of the most important parts of a console's legacy. If the controller isn't comfortable or doesn't have a useful new feature, it probably won't grab people. Look at the PS4 before Sony had a bunch of exclusives. Some players only got it because the controller was cool. So I figured we could go back and look at the controllers of a bunch of different consoles. Of course, we have to start off with the Atari controller. It's just such a classic and iconic design. I don't like it that much. I understand it only has one button and a joystick because it has to run games like this, but oh my gosh, is this thing uncomfortable. The overall size of it just cramps up my hand and I can never make it work with me. In the end, it just isn't that great of a controller. I know classic video game fans will get mad at me for saying that, but I just can't deal with all of that. The NES controller was a big improvement from the Atari controller. Instead of a joystick, we have a D-pad, which works better for platformers or puzzle-type games. Overall, the NES controller was a lot better than the Atari, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have its problems. The corners kinda jab into my palms of my hand, which got uncomfortable after a little while. Luckily for us, when Nintendo released the NES top loader, they made a new NES controller with more rounded edges. But they made the A and B buttons more slanted, so you have to hold your thumb at an awkward angle. Both versions of the NES controller have advantages, but struggle in different areas. But when Nintendo released the SNES, they had an even better controller. This controller had an additional 2 face buttons and added some shoulder buttons. This allowed controller layouts to be more diverse, and more games use the face buttons in smarter ways, so you don't have to worry about holding an awkward angle with your thumb. Since the Super Nintendo controller was pretty good, let's see what the N64 has. What is this? I don't know what species Nintendo designed this controller for, but it definitely wasn't humans. So, now we have an analog stick, which is important for 3D platformers like Banjo and Kazooie or Donkey Kong 64. We also see the D-pad make a return along with these arrow keys. I'm gonna be honest, I have no clue why they went with arrow keys, but they are useful in some games. Then on the back, we have this lonely trigger. This acts like a third shoulder button in most games. In all honesty, I can see what they're going for in this controller. The stick is in the middle, so if you need to use it, you hold the middle and right grips, but if you need to use the D-pad, you hold the left and right grips. I can understand the idea, but it just comes off as a little wonky overall. But in the end, it's still a decent enough controller. Well, let's move on to the GameCube controller next. If an orgasm had a physical form, it'd probably look like this. The GameCube controller is so well made. The triggers are amazing, the joystick feels so responsive, and the buttons are nice and crisp. Everything about this controller is really good. I know the button layout is strange, but it's actually very well done. The A button is the main focus with a smaller B button below it, and the X and Y buttons are surrounding it. This makes games like Mario Kart and Tony Hawk work well, since the A button is the one you'll be using the most. I also like how the A button is this bright green orb, which makes it easier to spot if you aren't used to the controller. Nintendo just made a really nice controller. They even still make them since they have special Smash Bros editions of them. And pretty much every game on the Switch can be played with a GameCube controller if you have the adapter. Following the GameCube, Nintendo released the Wii. And this controller is one of the more meh ones to me. The regular remote by itself has an A button, B button on the back, and a 1 and 2 button near the bottom. Most games don't use all the buttons on the remote if you're only supposed to use it by itself, since usually the main focus would be the motion controls instead of actually pushing buttons. But if we jam in a nunchuck, that gives us some extra buttons and a thumbstick. This makes games a little bit more bearable, but compared to the GameCube, we did just lose an extra stick. But we still do have the motion controls to help make up for that. While the button placement and feel isn't the best in my opinion, it still has some other good features. Like the motion controls and gyro. Sure, some games use it in a gimmicky way, but games like Mario Galaxy and Skyward Sword make it feel impactful to the gameplay. And of course, we can't forget about the amazing speaker the controller has. This one little remote had so many useless plastic accessories. Sure, the Wii Zapper made you feel like you were committing homicide, but all it was just a plastic shell for the remote. You can look at pretty much any store that sells gaming accessories. I promise you'll find these unnecessary add-ons like the golf clubs or tennis rackets. After the Wii came the Wii U, and oh man do I love the gamepad. It has so many features like the camera, rumble, NFC reader, and other stuff. Of course, the main feature of the controller is the giant screen. The screen is pretty well made. I've never had any frame or resolution drops while using it before. And it's also a touchscreen, which some games make use of. The triggers are these giant slabs that feel so nice to click, and both sticks feel pretty high quality as well. I know people complain that the battery runs out pretty fast, but it has a lot going on, so it's kind of forgivable. Even if the Wii U supports multiple other controllers, most of the time I'd rather just use the gamepad, and that's just how cool it is to me. But if we're talking about cool, just take a look at the Nintendo Switch Joy-Cons. These things have a lot of tech going on. An IR camera, HD rumble, NFC, these things are just jam-packed with features. And unlike the gamepad, the battery life lasts a pretty decent amount of time. Before I got my Pro Controller, I'd only have to charge them once every 3 or 4 days. Keep in mind, I didn't use my Switch a huge amount, but they lasted a good while. While Nintendo's history of controllers hasn't been consistent, they've had a lot of good ones. Which is why we should take a look at Microsoft and Sony to see what they have going on. The original PS1 controller didn't have the thumbsticks. You were left with only a D-pad. Which for some games wasn't a huge problem, but games like Crash Bandicoot and Tomb Raider would have worked a lot better with them. Which is why Sony later released the DualShock controller. With the addition of double thumbsticks, a lot of 3D platformers and racing games felt so much better to control. It was just such a great change for the company to make to the controllers, which is why for the PS2 they made the exact same thing. This wasn't the worst idea Sony could have come up with, the DualShock worked pretty well. My only complaint is that the handles are so short and thin. After a while my hands started to cramp up a bit. If the PS2 controller had more rounded grips, I think it would have made for a good controller. But it was still pretty solid. Let's see what the PS3 was cooking up for its controller. Okay, this is ridiculous. I understand the phrase, if it isn't broken, don't fix it, but come on, could you not think of anything new here? We've had the same design for the past 3 consoles. The PS3 controller did add some worthy changes, such as the controller being wireless and having some motion control capabilities. While I do love Sony and their products, I think they could have given us something new with the PS3 controller. Never mind, I take that back. Luckily for us, they changed up the controller when the PS4 rolled around. Just like the GameCube, I'm fully in love with this controller's design and features. The grips are finally more rounded, which makes it easier to hold on for long sessions of gameplay. And they added a trackpad which can sense your finger whenever you swipe it or tap on it. And don't even get me started on the triggers, they are just so incredibly satisfying to push down. Compared to the PS3 controller, this one is so much better. It even comes with this cool little light bar. The color will change depending on what's happening in the game, but I mostly just use it for a flashlight. And last up for PlayStation is the PS5 controller. Just like the Joy-Cons, this little guy has some impressive stuff going on. HD rumble, motion controls, adaptive triggers, lots of interesting things going on here. I personally always turn off rumble and things like that. I just never found it to be appealing, but oh man, does it work well here. Especially in Astro's Playroom, this game allows you to test all of the features the PS5 controller has. And that game does a good job of showing off the new hardware. Last up will be Microsoft's Xbox controllers. And of course, we're starting off with the Duke. This chunky boy takes up a lot of room in your hands, and most of it is due to the giant Xbox logo in the middle, just in case you forget what console you're playing on. The joysticks are nice and the buttons are pretty alright. Not an amazing controller, but it could be worse. In 2005, Microsoft released the Xbox 360, and wow, is this a great controller. The buttons have a nice click to them, and the triggers are in a great location, and the overall controller just melts in my hands immediately. The buttons are also color coordinated, so for most games you don't have to memorize a letter, just a color, which I'm sure some users appreciated. The Xbox 360 really outdid itself with the controller. It's just so perfect in so many ways. Next up is the Xbox One controller. Just like the Xbox 360 controller, it's very well done here. The controller feels just a tad bit heavier here, but other than that, they're pretty much the same. The Xbox One controller does have a bit more of a premium feel to it. Not that the Xbox 360 controller was cheaply made, just that this one feels a bit more higher quality. But if you want high quality, take a look at the Xbox Series X controller. I could go on all day about how much I love the D-pad on this thing. It just feels so crisp and beautiful. The buttons also feel a bit more clicky, which I vibe with. While Xbox is personally my least favorite gaming console, they make some amazing controllers, so you have to respect them for that. Over the years, we've had plenty of different controllers. Some worked out, some flopped extremely hard. Having a good controller is important for the reputation of a console. While I'm not a huge fan of some controller designs, I think it's important that each console has its own signature controller that the player will remember for a long time. Controllers are important. If you don't have something interesting or innovative, some players won't be captivated. But as long as Nintendo doesn't do this again, we should be fine.